Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends in the Dharma. Nice to see you all again. This talk is by our president, Dr. Desmond Biddulph. He's been the president of the Buddhist Society for a few years now, and he's been affiliated with the society for many years. He trains in the Rinzai Zen tradition and has been doing so, and he gives an awful lot of his time and effort here, and fair to say that the functioning of the society would be very difficult without his input. So today, on this very auspicious day, the 90th anniversary of the Buddhist Society Founders' Day, Desmond is going to give a talk about that and hopefully some entertaining stuff from the annals of the society. We are very much looking forward to it, and so I hand over to you, Desmond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you very much for coming. It's really a great pleasure to see you here, and it's a tribute to the people who put in all that work and enthusiasm all those years ago, that here we are 90 years later celebrating the 90th anniversary of the Buddhist Society. I think it's quite fantastic. This talk will cover a tiny thin slice of history. It's a particular one. It's not a general history of Buddhism coming to the West, but it's really to do with friends and relations, people that we've known in the past, people the Buddhist Society has been associated with, and our peculiar history. So really it sort of goes back into the last century. We're not going to sort of go back and look at Schopenhauer and Max Muller and the Archaeological Survey of India and anything like that. We're going to start quite narrowly with the Theosophical Society. Now, the Theosophical Society was a strange and interesting entity, and it did an enormous amount to bring Eastern culture in its own particular way to the West. I should also say that in this sort of brief introduction, that the people we're going to look at have not necessarily followed a strict sort of either intellectual line or necessarily totally comprehensible approach to truth. But the one thing that can be said about all of them, every single one of them, is they were true seekers after understanding, knowledge, wisdom, compassion, and most of all, they wanted to solve the problem, this human problem, this problem of human existence. That's what they did, and they did it in their own peculiar, often, and idiosyncratic manner. So some of the people here that we'll talk about have, come in for a lot of flack from the academic side, from intellectuals and so on. However, we're not particularly interested in that. We're interested in the heart of these people and what motivated them and inspired them, and what ultimately came out of the work and the commitment that they made in their own individual lives. But we'll start with the Theosophical Society because our feet, in a way, are in the Theosophical Society. The Buddhist Society was intimately connected with the Theosophical Society. And some years ago, when they were doing some renovation work here at the Society, they decided to clean up the Rupa, the Buddha statue next door in the little shrine room. And when they emptied it out, they discovered, and to some people's horror, a photograph of Madame Blavatsky right in the middle of the Rupa. Well, this caused considerable consternation among certain of our rather more serious members of the council. And but I'm glad to say it was stealthily put back in again afterwards. So it is actually there, which is a good thing. Now, if we look up here and we see what the Theosophical Society was about, the three objects of the Theosophical Society, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color, to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science, and to negotiate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. Well, those are extremely worthy and worthy things to pursue. and it would be quite marvellous if more of us put a bit more effort into this sort of thing. But the Theosophical Society has a strange and interesting history. And we'll first of all start with Madame Blavatsky. Now, Madame Blavatsky was a most interesting woman. And I should say that she was born in 1831 in present-day Ukraine. And she had two sides to her family. One was German nobility and the other was Russian nobility. And you can see her ancestors going right the way back to the very early founders of Russia when the Norwegian settlers, or settlers from Sweden, Norway, came over through Finland and down into mainland Russia. And she could trace one of the founders was Runik, the founder of the Russian state in Novgorod. And from her other side, they were Prussians, and their name was Han. So they're a very interesting family. And she was born in the Ukraine. Her parents were provincial governors, and she was expected to follow a very straight line and marry into the nobility, have lots and lots of children, be an adornment for her husband and the social life, political life that he used to lead. But she was having none of that. And she entered a sham marriage when she was in her early 20s, and it was a sort of pretense to a much older man, and she escaped by night and set off on her travels. And during the next 20 or so years, she traveled all over the world. She traveled to Cairo, throughout the Middle East. She traveled to the Far East. She traveled to America. She apparently even went to Tibet and spent time in Tashi Lumpo. But the Theosophical Society at this time was not really an entity, but she was a very earnest seeker after truth. She was certainly eccentric and an extremely unusual person in every way. The significant and important meeting that took place between Madame Blavatsky and this gentleman, who has a most magnificent beard, and you'll all know as Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, took place at the Eddy Ranch in Orange County, New Jersey, in 1874. Olcott was a distinguished American solicitor, civil servant, and patriot. He, at some point, even took part in the pursuit of the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. Took part in the Civil War, fought in the Civil War, but he became, in the latter part of the 19th century, very, very interested in seances and spirit and the spiritual, the Spiritist movement, and that was really where what took him to the Eddy Ranch, because the Eddy brothers were known for their seances, and it was there that Madame Blavatsky also found herself. So the two met, and it was like the meeting of two minds, and they discovered that they had so much in common that it was at that point that they actually founded the Theosophical Society. And that had very, very long and enduring consequences. They both were very interested in Buddhism. Madame Blavatsky had discovered a lot about Buddhism, particularly with her visits apparently to Tibet, and certainly in India, where she'd spent a considerable amount of time. So she'd been exposed to those things, and Olcott himself was interested in those subjects. And they actually converted to Buddhism while they were in America. But they decided to take a trip to India and to Sri Lanka. And it should be said that Sri Lanka, which was a Buddhist country and had been a Buddhist country since the time of the Buddha, had been occupied, as you know, by colonial powers of one kind or another, including the Dutch, the British, the Portuguese. They'd all been there in Sri Lanka, and various different brands of Christianity had been forced on the population of Sri Lanka. Catholicism, Anglicanism, and all the rest of it. And the country had very low morale, really, about its own culture. And what happened was that Blavatsky and Colonel Steele Olcott went to Sri Lanka, and there they are together. I must say they are quite a pair, aren't they? I mean, imagine being able to grow a beard like that. That in itself is an achievement. But they are quite a pair, aren't they? When they arrived there in Colombo, there was a huge crowd there to meet them. I mean, an enormous crowd. Tens of thousands of people greeted them in the streets. And then they actually undertook a formal taking of the precepts. And this was a very important event, both in the history of Buddhism for Sri Lanka and in the history of Sinhalese or Ceylonese Sri Lankan nationalism. Here we can see Colonel Olcott with the Venerable Hikkaduwa Sri Sumangala Nayaka Thero in Sri Lanka. And this was the man with whom he took the precepts. Olcott was of slightly different cut, really, from Blavatsky, but he was a very, very sincere believer in Buddhism. But when they both converted, this had an extraordinary effect on the Sri Lankan population, because they suddenly realized they had carried, and they'd been the bearers of the truth of the Dharma for centuries and centuries and centuries, and what had been undervalued by the colonial powers suddenly started to rise up. And Buddhism became, and maybe this is an unfortunate thing, became a sort of center around which Sri Lankan nationalism began to crystallize. If you go to Colombo, you will see outside the main rail station a very, very large and imposing statue of Olcott, and it's quite a pleasure to see it there. You know, I don't know if many of the population passing by really know who he was, but he himself and Blavatsky have left a lasting mark on the life of Sri Lanka, and particularly Buddhist life. He founded in all 30 Sri Lankan colleges that actually taught in the vernacular and also taught Buddhism. The Ananda College in Colombo is still there. The Mahindi College in Gaul is still there. And there are people who I've met who've been educated at the schools that he actually founded. So he was an extremely important figure. But they went on, and he went on, to found the Theosophical Society in Adya, in southern India. Now our next picture is of Anagarika Dharmapala. He was previously Don David Hugh of Vatena, who was born in September 1864, died 29th of April 1933. He was a very important figure in bringing Buddhism to the West. He went to 2 or 3 different Christian schools when he was growing up. Went to Christian College in Kotta. He went to St. Benedict's College near Colombo. He went to St. Thomas's College, and finally to the Colombo Academy. All of them were basically Christian-based. And when Olcott arrived in Sri Lanka, Olcott and Blavatsky, he was so present there, and he became very, very interested in Buddhism. His family was, of course, Buddhist, and so then he started to read Buddhism, became more and more absorbed in it, and finally he founded what's called the Mahabharati Society. I'm sure you've all heard of. And the Mahabharati Society ultimately gave rise to the Chisik Vihara, And this year is the 150th anniversary of Anagarika Dharmapala's birth. And it will be celebrated, with us all, with the Buddhist Society and with the Chiswick Vihara. We're having a big tea party, a bit of a bash to celebrate his birth. Dharmapala was really a most interesting man. He was completely dedicated to Buddhism and to propagating Buddhism in the West. And one of the really important things that he did was actually go to the old Buddhist sites. Now, he'd read that Sir Edwin Arnold, and Edwin Arnold's portrait is downstairs in the library, you've all seen it, a large Victorian gentleman with his beard and his medals and so on. That is Sir Edwin Arnold. He had actually been to the site of the Buddha's enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, and he discovered that it was in a state of complete ruin, and at that time a small grant had been given to Sir Alexander Cunningham to actually renovate the site. Sir Alexander Cunningham was in charge of the Archaeological Survey of India. He discovered it, and it was actually in the hands of the Brahmins. So he went off to visit it. And there's another photograph of him there when he was quite a bit older. And that's Sir Edwin Arnold. I think I'll just skip ahead. Well, I can go back and we can look at Edwin Arnold. But there it is. The picture you see here on the left is how it actually was when it was discovered by Sir Alexander Cunningham in a completely overgrown state. You can see vines and so on climbing up the exterior of the building, and it was really quite in a shocking state. And he went to it, was downhearted by the sight of it, upset because this was the place where the Buddha was enlightened. This is the place of the diamond throne where Buddhism had spread out. This was a site that commemorated one of the great events in human civilization, and he was terribly depressed and upset at the very site where his own religion, Buddhism, of Sri Lanka, had been so overlooked. So he set about forming a society that would renovate these sites. And so he started work on doing that and collecting money to do it. And as we've said, Sir Edwin Arnold is a very big figure too. They all come together in the most strange and interesting way. So Edwin Arnold visited Bodh Gaya, as I said, in 1880, and he was a very interesting figure. He was educated at a public school in England, went to the University College, Oxford, in which he won the Newdigate Prize for poetry. And this ability of writing poetry was to remain with him ever since. He taught for a while at a school, and then was appointed principal in 1856 to the Government Sanskrit College at Pune. And this was a school in India which actually taught Sanskrit. And this had been set up by the British government. So during that 7-year period, he was exposed to Sanskrit, to Brahmin philosophy, to Buddhism, and later in 1879 he was to write The Light of Asia. And The Light of Asia was a book about Gautama, the Buddha. And it had a very profound effect on Western society. He at that time was the editor of the Daily Telegraph, and so it had enormous exposure. And for the first time it brought Buddhism to the ordinary man in the street. And The Light of Asia was a great bestseller. It was sold all over the world and in different translations. Now many people have criticized The Light of Asia because it makes the Buddha sound as if he's a Christian, which of course he couldn't be, not more different, but there was a really distinct difference between Christianity and Buddhism. But he, perhaps because of his own Christian background, coloured The Light of Asia a little bit in that way. Nevertheless, it does remain, for those of you who've read it, quite an inspiring text. It's beautifully written, extremely sensitive. And it does get some of the essence, particularly the warmth and the love of the Buddha, into words, something which is extremely difficult to do. And it is in itself quite an inspiring text. So there he is. And here he is. This is the portrait we have downstairs in the library. And there he is writing, taking notes, and so on. It's interesting. He had a habit of, apparently, so we've heard, of hiding jewellery around his house, little jewels, rubies, pearls, and so on, in bits of furniture, under carpets, and so on. And a journalist from the Telegraph, had heard about this, possibly because he'd read something of Sir Edwin Arnold in the annals of the Telegraph. But he came here because we have Sir Edwin Arnold's chair downstairs. And he thought that maybe there'd been a jewel secreted in it. And a couple of years ago, he spent the whole afternoon with his chair trying to pull it apart, trying to think of little sort of slots you could press and out would come a jewel. But he didn't find one. But maybe the jewel that he really brought was the jewel of the Dharma in a new way to the West. And again, very important. Now, this man, it's not a particularly good photograph of him, but this is Ananda Kumar Swami. And he started off, strangely enough, as a geologist and mineralogist. And he was educated here in London. And he went off initially to work following his profession, which he was trained as a mineralogist and geologist. But it was there that he was exposed to the religion of his forefathers and to his family. And gradually, throughout his life, he became more and more interested in Indian philosophy, in Buddhist and the art of India. And he ended his days finally actually in America, in the United States, in 1947, born in 1877. But he was very interesting. He wrote some absolutely beautiful books on Buddhist iconography, and they're still worth reading today. Many people are again critical of them, but he was a true seeker after truth and after his own particular way of understanding the nature of Buddhism. And he was the first one who I think really brought the idea of the aniconic vision of the Buddha, because as you probably know, the Buddha, when he first was pictured, it was always either as an empty throne or as a pillar, always in a way which was not actually of the Buddha himself. It always pointed towards something else, footsteps, a wheel, and so on. And he wrote a beautiful book on this. And people became very interested in his work, both on that side, but he also wrote a very interesting and important book, which was a book which was to influence and have a profound effect on Christmas Humphreys. But we'll come to that a little bit later. This is A.C. March, who was the editor of Buddhism in England, and this is when it was part of the Buddhist, actually initially when it was part of the Theosophical Society, and he was co-founder of the Buddhist Lodge with Christmas Humphreys. And this is a very important figure. He was Ananda Matea. Ananda Matea started life as he had a Roman Catholic education. I have a feeling he went to the same school as I did, actually. But he became interested in non-Christian ways of finding the truth, and his particular approach was through the Order of the Golden Dawn. And the Order of the Golden Dawn was a very interesting collection of people, amongst whom at some time was W.B. Yeats and somebody called Mathers, who you may have heard of, and also probably somebody that probably everybody in this room might well have heard of was Alastair Crowley. And Alastair Crowley was a very interesting, rather perhaps sinister figure. I had the dubious pleasure of meeting him when I was a little boy, And at that time he used to wear knickerbockers and a sort of, he wandered around knickerbockers. He wore a kind of a fez on his head. And at that time, my mother and myself during the war, we lived in a boarding house, and he lived in the room next door. Now, my mother tells me that when I first met Crowley, I screamed in horror. But very soon after that, I was sitting on his knee. And he was bouncing me up and down. But anyway, he was a very strange, interesting character. And but Ananda Mattaya wasn't taken in by him for too long, because he went off to Sri Lanka, and there in Sri Lanka he studied yoga. And he actually became an aficionado of yoga, not of Buddhism. But that took him to a certain, stage along the path. And his next step was to go to Burma. And in Burma he actually became ordained as a Buddhist monk. And in this picture here you see him in a rather contemplative mood, thoughtful, sort of looking down, meditative mood. But here is another photograph. And I think this one gives a much better depiction of his character, because he was really a very determined person. You can see from that, can't you? You can see the look in his face and so on. Well, he must have been, if you think about it. He went against all the sort of normal ways of the time, and really led quite an extraordinary life. But he came back to the UK, and he finally disrobed, actually, out of ill health. But he got involved also with the Theosophists. He wrote an interesting book on Buddhism, and was a very important figure in early Buddhism in the UK. Yes, this gentleman was the Venerable Tai Su, the third Buddhist missionary to England, and acclaimed by many as a leading figure in the revival of Buddhism in China. He actually gave a lot of money to the Buddhist Society during the time when it was really struggling and having a difficult time. And he was a friend of Christmas Humphreys, and he was a well-known figure in England. And that's quite a nice photograph of him there in his monastic robes. He actually spent a lot of time in Burma and China. And this is a picture of Buddhism in England, the Journal of Oriental Philosophy and Religion, London, the Buddhist Lodge, 1932. Editor Christmas Humphreys. And here we are with contributions by D.T. Suzuki, Beatrice Lane Suzuki, and H.P. Blavatsky. So its feet were still tangled up in Theosophy, as you can see here in 1932. This is the middle way in 1946, volume 21, number 2, and the middle way in 1951. We haven't changed a great deal, and here it is now. Hardly changed at all, really, have we? Yes. Now he's an interesting man, and he did a lot of early work for Buddhism. Francis Story, Anagarika Priyadashi Sugatananda. Born in 1910 in London during World War I, he lived in India as a voluntary worker for the Mahabharati Society, after which he was a life member. And for 25 years he lived in Asian countries where he studied the Buddhist philosophy. He was fond of the Burma Buddhist Franciscan rite of blessing of animals in the tradition of St. Francis. He founded the Burma Buddhist World Mission in Rangoon in 1950. And he was a contributor to several Buddhist periodicals. In 1951 he wrote Buddhism Answers the Marxist Challenge, and he lectured on Buddhism in Singapore and Penang, and he lived in Rangoon for several years, and he passed away back in London at the age of 61, but he made a great contribution to Buddhism. And here we have a nice photograph of Bhikkhu Utitala. His name is rather strange. Utitala of Burma with Christmas Humphreys in 1947. He was a great scholar, and he wrote the Book of Analysis. He spent his life actually on the Abhidharma, studying the Abhidharma Pitaka. And really, once you get people like this, like the Bhikkhu Titala, getting involved in Buddhism in the UK, a lot of the old things sort of fall away, because here we are right in the heart of Buddhist philosophy, with its sort of adamantine or crystalline structure almost. And these ideas began to get into Buddhism. It was no longer quite so emotional, no longer quite so romantic, but here we are right in the philosophy, the heart of the philosophy. And he was an extremely important figure. He born in 1896 and died in 1997, lived to be 101 years old. He was quite a character. This is a lovely picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1958. And the reason why I had this picture put in was because, to make a sort of summary, really, Buddhism, was made up of really enthusiasts and people who had some sort of feeling that maybe there was some truth that lay outside the Judeo-Christian tradition. And they went to all sorts of length to try and sort of find that. It was part of the sort of non-conformist movement of the Edwardian period and going back into the late Victorian period. People seeking and looking. It was also a time, one should say, of great confidence as well, where people felt able to do that. And I suppose by the 1930s, the Theosophy, the Rhys Davids had translated the Pali Canon. Other people were looking at Buddhism from different points of view. Max Muller had translated the Upanishads. On the continent, people like Schopenhauer had been working on philosophy and had become very interested in Buddhism there. And the romantic philosophers of Central Europe and Germany had made enormous inroads, particularly with their translation work into Buddhism. It was all becoming, much sort of down to earth, much closer to what Buddhism actually was. Prior to that, it had been something which was, I suppose, almost an emotional reaction of the heart. Something that people were striving for, weren't really sure what it was. Now, in 1959, as you all know, the Dalai Lama left Tibet after the invasion of Tibet in 1958, and with the diaspora of the Tibetan Buddhists coming to the West, there was really quite an enormous change, because with the Tibetans came an enormous flood of both enthusiasts, and those were the Tibetan monks who actually came, the Tibetan lamas, and masses of translation material, of ritual, meditation techniques, and so on. I'm going to go back actually to this photograph of the Dalai Lama. And we only have to look now at Buddhism, and a lot of people really consider themselves Buddhist because they've heard the Dalai Lama speak. And that's all because they're sort of fans of the Dalai Lama, that's perhaps what they understand Buddhism to be. And the Dalai Lama has the most enormous following. And it's really through, much of his work is, I would say evangelizing is not quite the right word, but just allowing himself to be exposed to the general public, that he has been able to transfer something of the essence of Buddhism to mass audiences all over the world. And he was actually, the Buddhist Society, because we thought we could help him during that period, we offered him the patronage of the society, or suggested it to him. And he did become the patron of the Buddhist Society, and we felt that it would protect him a little bit against the Chinese if he was a patron of some Western institution. And so he became the patron of the Buddhist Society. And that really was, I think, an important time and interesting causes and conditions that actually did happen. And here he is in this very nice photograph of him as a very young man. And it's really quite beautiful. Here we are. This is Christmas Humphreys with Govinda. Govinda wrote a number of. He again was a great sort of a great eccentric, a great truth seeker, German in origin. I think also he'd read Novalis and so on, part of the sort of German Romantic movement, became very interested in Tibetan Buddhism, spent time in Tibetan Plateau and so on, and wrote some really wonderful, inspiring books on Buddhism. And many people have come to Buddhism actually through reading Govinda's work. You could argue again about actually just how doctrinal it is and so on, but he was a very inspiring figure. And here he is in his probably self-created robes, and there he is with his wife, and they make real colourful couple. And there's TCH, Toby Humphreys, beside them, standing outside the Buddhist Society. Quite lovely, actually. Then this is a lovely picture of Trungpa Rinpoche and Akon Rinpoche when they first came to the Buddhist Society. And it'll be remembered that the Tibet Society was actually founded just shortly after the invasion of Tibet by a number of really quite interesting philanthropic souls in the UK. One of them was Francis Beaufort Palmer, and there were a couple others. They wrote a letter to the Times, and then they founded the Tibet Society. They had nowhere to actually put it. So Humphreys, who knew Beaufort Palmer, said, well, why don't you put it in the basement, in our basement in Eccleston Square? So it came here, and this is where the Tibet Society was, right downstairs in the basement. And this is two lovely, well, it's a beautiful photograph of two young or almost innocent-looking monks who came here for the first time, and they had very little in terms of money. They almost had nothing, in fact. And Humphreys used to give them money for clothes, for food, and so on, until they got themselves established. And we know that Trungpa and Akon went off to form Sami Ling, and then Trungpa went off to America, and you probably know the sort of history. But before one is too critical or critical at all about maybe Trungpa, remember the journey that he'd had through his life, which was extremely hard and very difficult. And he founded a movement of which has many, many adherents and brought the Dharma to an enormous number of people. And we know the tragic end, don't we, of Akon Rinpoche, who was sadly murdered not so long ago in China. So and this is just in our own lifetime, This is the Dalai Lama. This is D.T. Suzuki. Suzuki is a very important figure in the history of Buddhism. I'm going to go skip quickly through this now. I've probably spent too long talking about the others, but D.T. Suzuki had a profound effect on the spread of Buddhism in the United States, mainly because of his unique appreciation of Buddhism and his understanding of Western philosophy. He was a very bright and intelligent student at Tokyo University. He first went to the United States with his teacher, Shoen Saku, to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, and his teacher was the master at Engakukuji in 1892, and he was a very interesting person. People misunderstand something about him, but his teacher, in the Rinzai tradition of Zen, was brought up very formally as a young, from I think at 12 years old he was brought to the monastery and ordained, and then went through the full training. But when he'd actually finished his training, he then went to Sri Lanka and studied Pali and Theravada Buddhism. So he knew all about the southern tradition. He came back to Japan and was invited to the World Parliament of Religion and took with him the young D.T. Suzuki. And D.T. Suzuki spoke English very well and was invited back by Karas, who was a publisher, went back to America, and then D.T. Suzuki's own personality were enabled, to that feeling of what Buddhism was in its essence, to be sort of manifested through the means that he truly understood himself, which was Western philosophy, the Mahayana Buddhism, through the intellectual sort of route. But he had a profound effect, strangely enough, on not so much on intellectuals, but on the beatniks, people of that kind. Beatniks, the artists, the musicians of that period. They were very, very influenced by Suzuki. And I don't think it could possibly have been particularly through his writings, which those of you who have read them are quite dense. And you do need to know a little bit about Western philosophy to actually appreciate Suzuki. And they are quite marvellous, his readings, but you do need to have a proper background in Western philosophy and Western education. I think it was actually his presence that influenced people. He really had this profound effect, and it was here in London that D.T. Suzuki and Humphreys met, and they met at the World Conference of Faith, I think it was called, not Parliament of Religion, but World Conference of Faiths in the 1930s. And apparently the word went out that Suzuki was arriving and that he was going to give a talk. And Humphreys was told, if he doesn't turn up, 'cause he's coming all the way from Japan, you'll have to talk in his place. And Humphreys, in his biography, both sides of the circle, say how terrified he was that Suzuki wouldn't turn up, but he'd have to talk. And Suzuki at that time was really had spent quite a bit of time in the West, and his English was very good. And Humphreys was deeply embedded, I suppose, in Theravada Buddhism. And he'd been studying the Abhidharma, and he'd studied the philosophy and sort of foundations of Buddhism. And I think that the topic of the actual conference was the highest ideal in religion. And Suzuki came along and gave a very simple, down-to-earth talk about religion. It started off by him talking about the Japanese house, and this is how it's described in both sides of the circle. He said, I don't know very much about the highest ideal, he said, but I'll tell you something about Japanese life. So he started to talk about the simplicity of a Japanese home, how the walls are made paper screens and so on. He said, and you can open the doors, and there you are, sitting there, and there's the garden, and you're not sure where the house ends and the garden begins, and nature flows in and your own nature flows out. And as he talked, Humphreys would feel himself sort of relaxing, sort of letting go. He said, I don't really know very much about these great high ideals, but I do know that the true religion is to be found in these very simple experience of oneness with nature. And of course, that had a profound effect on Humphreys. Yeah, and he then became interested in Zen Buddhism. In fact, changed from being a Southern Buddhist to being part of the Mahayana movement, and then taught a Zen class here at the Society. We'll move on. Well, here we are. There's D.T. Suzuki, as you can see here. Mihoko, that's his young assistant. She was interned during the Second World War in quite a frightening place in the middle of the Californian desert in the high Sierras. It was an internment camp built literally in the middle of nowhere, absolutely in the middle of nowhere. And her parents were very happy apparently in that camp, although they had very little food and it was a strict regime. And when she got to New York after the end of the war, she met Suzuki. She was only 18 years old. And she became so interested in him that she became his assistant. She traveled with him all over the world. And she now lives in Kyoto in Japan, still alive. And she was of great assistance to Suzuki in everything he did. Here we have Mr. Humphreys. I'm not quite sure who these other ones are, actually. Let's have a look. Oh yes, Ronald Fussell is there. Anyway, they make quite an interesting group, don't they? but time won't allow us to do this. Now this is Venerable Myokyo Ni, or Irmgard Schlogel as she was in those days. And you can see sitting here with D.T. Suzuki, and here we have Alan Watts. And Alan Watts was again a big figure in bringing Far Eastern ideas and thoughts to the West. He was a schoolboy at King's Canterbury when he first started corresponding with Christmas Humphreys, and Humphreys thought he was a housemaster because he wrote so well. And apparently there was a knock on the front door, and Humphreys opened the door, and there was this sort of 17-year-old schoolboy, 17 or 18-year-old schoolboy. And, who are you? He said, I'm Alan Watts. Totally astonished. Alan Watts, as we know, went on and had a very strange and interesting career in America, and did a lot to sort of disseminate Buddhism. He was also an editor of The Middle Way. And there's Irmgard Schlogel as a young woman when she first came to England, and of course D.T. Suzuki here. And she became head of the Zen Center in London. Another photograph in there. And this is Irmgard Schlogel here. She went to Japan and spent, I think, 12 years in a Rinzai Zen monastery doing a full formal training there, inspired by Christmas Humphreys, who in turn had been inspired by Suzuki, and she brought back, well, say the living essence of the Rinzai tradition, Zen tradition, and she formed Shoboan, Fairlight, and so on, and that those are both thriving institutions of their own. There's Humphreys with Suzuki and Konza. And Konza was an extremely important figure. He was very eccentric. That's a lovely drawing of D.T. Suzuki, and it was made for the New Yorker. And it was given to us by his niece, by the artist's niece, I should say. There's Suzuki and Humphreys. Humphreys and his wife, Irene Faulkner. There's Humphreys again. I'll just say a few things about Humphreys because he is our founder, and this is Founders' Day. Now, I'm not going to spend too much on it. Humphreys, as we know, was born at a time when probably England was at its most confident. In the early Edwardian period, he was born the year, I think, that Queen Victoria died. He was educated at an English public school, went to Cambridge, went to Trinity Hall, studied the law, became a Queen's Counsel, received silk, had a very distinguished career at the bar. Causes and conditions brought him to Buddhism, and that really was the sudden and unexpected death of his elder brother in the trenches in 1918. And a shell went off while he was just during a lull in the fighting just nearby, and it took out his elder brother Richard, just like that. The man standing next to him, his orderly, was totally untouched. Humphreys at that time was at school, and it caused him to have a nervous breakdown. He became so ill and distraught that he was removed from school. He had up until that time been brought up as and believed completely in Christianity. As he said in his own book, he thought God or Jesus was a sort of super Boy Scout, sort of like a scout leader, and that God was sort of dispensing justice in a very friendly way above the scout leader. And of course all that sort of came apart, fell to bits. But it was that time that he actually picked up the book, Buddha and the Gospel of Buddhism by Kumar Swami, which had been written in 1916 in London. And the idea of the book was to set forth as simply as possible, to set forth the Gospel of Buddhism according to Buddhist scriptures, and to consider the Buddhist systems in relation, on the one hand, to the Brahmanical systems in which they originated, and on others to the system of Christian mysticism, which afford the nearest analogies. So, on the one hand, it talked about the Upanishads and the origins of the Buddha Dharma, and on the other, it tried to link it, the experiences of the Buddha's enlightenment, with Christian mysticism. And he read that book, and he said, if that is Buddhism, then whatever else I am, and he was a lot of other things, then I am a Buddhist. And at that point, he sort of set forth on the path to found the Buddhist Society and so on. But that came out of a great deal of unhappiness and misery. And if you read his book carefully, and you look at his own writings about how his life actually developed, you can see that throughout that period, his mind was never really, or his heart was never really at peace or at rest. So although he read that book, and he took it in, and it gave him a considerable amount of comfort, when he was at university at Trinity Hall, there is a quote actually when he writes about wandering around, and sort of saying, what's it all about, what's it all about? So I don't understand it. What on earth is it all about? So he was still taxed by sort of doubts, and this is a very good thing, because only if you're really taxed by these questions, if these things really do get to you, are you able to undertake any sort of path of discovery. If you never have a question of that kind, it never bothers you, then will you ever look? You probably won't. You'll be happy with just what comes along, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. But that doubt and unhappiness give rise to great things is a repeated pattern in human life. We see it everywhere. But in Humphrey's case, it took the death of his elder brother, and until that point, his life had been a sort of paradise of enjoyment. He'd been the younger boy. His mother took him everywhere and spoilt him terribly, and he was intellectually very bright and quite gifted. And it was this event that actually brought him really to question what life was about. So he then went on, as we know, to join the Theosophical Society, initially the Buddhist Lodge of the Theosophical Society, which then eventually became the Buddhist Society, and as we know it now. These are some nice photographs of him for you to look at. This is him in full fig, as you can see, with his wig on and red dress for court. And here he is outside 58, a little bit older, looking rather owlish. There he is again. I mean, those of you who know him, he was a lovely man, and he was always extremely welcoming and cheerful. And he never said anything negative about anyone. He rarely even said anything negative about the people he convicted. It was quite remarkable. He wrote lots of sort of interesting stories about all the crims he'd met during his times, the thieves and so on. And anyway, there's the Buddhist Society in its early days, which is a bit later. This is Hai Li. This is where the Buddhist Society used to have its summer schools in the early days. These are a group of bhikkhus. That's Myo Kyoni. That's Irmgard Schlegel, when she eventually became ordained. And there she is with Morinaga Roshi from Daitokuchi, where he'd been trained. This is where Anderson. This was her head monk when she was training, and he came over here in a series of summer schools, gave some very interesting talks, teishas, spent time with the students, and was a very inspiring figure. Martin Kulkat, who was the translator, who was a professor of Japanese studies at Princeton University, sitting here, and I think that was one of his translators there, that Japanese guy at the end. And here is Trevor Leggett. He's a very significant figure in bringing Eastern ideas to the West, particularly through judo and the martial arts. Here we are. John Snelling was at one time General Secretary of the Buddhist Society. Mike Hookham, who went on to was ordained in Nyingma tradition. Basil Sladen, Christmas Humphreys, and there's Venerable Myokyo Ni, Oyam God Shlogel, just at the back there. There's Morinaga Roshi and Myokyo Ni. There they are again. That's a summer school, not so long ago. He's quite a colourful character, but he wrote a lot, actually, contributed a lot to literature, and I think we have some of the copyrights of his books. And he spent most of his life actually in Hong Kong, and I'm just looking at my crib actually to give you a few more details about him. But he wrote about, I think, more than 20 books on Buddhism. John Eaton Calthorpe Blofeld, to give his full name, born in 1913 and died in 1987. And he did a very, very good job, actually, of popularizing, in particular, Chinese Buddhism and Taoism. And his books are still good to read, actually, and still quite inspiring. They're enjoyable. And that's Konza. Eberhard Edward Julius Dietrich Konza, 1904 to 1979, Anglo-German scholar. And he actually brought the Prajnaparamita literature to the West. He made an enormous contribution. He was more or less self-trained. He was an absolutely brilliant translator of texts. And those texts are actually still used today, although they have in some cases been superseded. But he actually did contribute quite a lot to the life of the society here. But he was a very strange and interesting man. And people like Eric Cheetham became his student, and there were others, and they formed a thing called Mahayana Study Group, and they worked on Mahayana Sutras. And then Eric Cheetham became an influential figure, especially in the life of the society, producing a lot of books, which have been useful in our syllabus, teaching syllabus. This is a beautiful picture here of the Dalai Lama with Geshe Geltsen. Geshe Geltsen used to teach here at the summer school in Buddhist Society. He was one of the first monks to come over here from Tibet after the invasion, and he looked after Tibetan children for I think 13 or 14 years in the Pestalozzi school here in England. He eventually went to America, where he founded a small group. Trevor Leggett, who was head of the Japanese service of the BBC, and wrote extensively on judo and Zen and the Japanese arts. This is myself and the Dalai Lama. We'll quickly skip over these. But the Buddhist Society has sort of gone on and contributed to interfaith in particular. This is actually a picture of Rowan Williams and Her Majesty the Queen, the Buddhist representatives of the Buddhist Vihara, Amravati and the Buddhist Society. So we're still sort of there, just sort of contributing as much as we can. This was actually Rowan Williams when he came here to the Buddhist Society, and we had the opportunity of doing a sort of interfaith discussion here with himself in the chair, Rowan Williams, and we looked at the Heart Sutra, and we looked at the Metta Sutta, and Rowan Williams commented on it, and it was a really quite an interesting and wonderful afternoon. And so the life of the Buddhist Society continues, but nowadays it's rather more formal. And this is just to look at the results of the census of 2011, because, as you can see here, 59% of people consider themselves Christians, so the recent remarks by the Prime Minister about being a Christian country, I suppose, is relevant and seems to be accurate in terms of the census anyway. No religion, 25%, not stated, 7%, others, 4%, Muslim, 5%. But then if you look here, Buddhists, you can see, form quite a large part, don't they? And it's said that there are about 250,000 Buddhists in the UK now. I leave the screen blank, because really what we should be talking about is something that these people have contributed. And it's not so much the content, because early on, in the early days of what came to be Buddhism as we understand it now, was not really understood. What was communicated, I think, by those early people, by Blavatsky and so on, was their dedication, their sincerity in their search, their absolute wholeheartedness to pursue and seek the truth. And even if it sounded extremely strange and odd at times, it communicated something. And that eventually became almost purified, actually, by the Dharma when it came across. And the Dharma, as it infiltrated or fused with these early seekers after truth, let's say, had an extraordinary kind of purifying effect. So now in the UK we actually do have established all the schools of Buddhism are here. And they're here both because they have monastic representation, and we've also, of course, got all the sutras which have now been translated into English. And if you want to find and you want to listen to a good teacher, you've only got to go onto YouTube and you'll find them. And you can go to talks, summer schools, all over the West now. Buddhism is beginning to make its mark in one form or another. But really the thing is, at the moment, it's not institutionalized. It still is in a very fresh and open, I suppose, medium. There's a sort of idea that there is a kind of modern Buddhism or neo-Buddhism or contemporary Buddhism. And it's made up of a sort of community of intellectuals, truth seekers, romantics, and so on, which it would include people from the past, people like D.T. Suzuki, musicians, people who have been influenced by, musically by Buddhism, poets, a collection of sort of teachers, people like the Dalai Lama, and so on. And all these people kind of form a community of Buddhists in the West. It's not so much true here in England, but in America, if you ask somebody and they say they're a Buddhist, they say, well, what school do you belong to? Well, they're quite likely to say, well, I went to a Theravada session last week, and I'm going to go to a Zen one in a month's time. So there's no kind of, streaming. But my own feeling is for Buddhism to really take hold, it does need for people to go right through a proper training, to go right through their own personal obstructions and difficulties, and to really find their place within themselves, to seek and to really find, and to work through their own personal difficulties and obstacles and so on, and to find peace of heart. It's very difficult to do that without the aid and the help of one of the main traditions, because the thing about the main traditions, they've seen all the problems before, and each tradition in itself is complete into itself, through its own language, ritual, and so on. It has met all these problems and difficulties before, and so it makes it a lot easier. You don't have to reinvent the wheel when you come up to something that's really hard to cope with and to face, because it's been seen before, understood before, a word has been put to it, it's understood, and it makes it much easier. But until people have been, I suppose, have really gone through the training and have really established themselves, and there have been 2 or 3 generations of these people, then we don't really know whether Buddhism will actually catch on fully in the West. It seems to be happening at the moment, and let's hope it does, because certainly we need it. We need people to be able to step aside, put their own personal interests away, and to be able to look at what's actually going on in the world and to act skillfully and wisely, and not to leave a devastated world for those that come after us, for the succeeding generations that follow us. But institutions like the Buddhist Society are a vehicle for people who want to train, who want to go through a personal process of transformation. And here you can find at the Society everything that's available. The teachers are here, you can do your meditation, your practice, you can join any of the schools, you can read as much as you like, and you'll be amongst a society of friends. The Society has done a lot. It's now moving forward into the cyber world. We're establishing ourselves on the internet, and we're contributing to civil life, civic life, to the argument, to interfaith meetings and holding public meetings, and also through the chaplaincy movement, which has done a great deal, made a contribution to civic life. The Buddhist Society is endorsing authority for the chaplains in the armed services, and we do all sorts of things. We hold summer schools and so on. And it is hoped that this, little bit by little bit, that the teachings of the Dharma will spread out, and hopefully succeeding generations will continue the work that was done so well and with such enthusiasm and dedication by our founder, Christmas Humphreys. So it's Humphreys we and all those early pioneers that we really give our thanks to today. And thank you for waiting so very long, in the whole hour and 5 minutes. Thank you very, very much. We'll get it over with. But anyway, downstairs we can have some tea, and there is a begging bowl on the way out if any of you feel impelled to give something to the Society. It's always useful for the electric light and for other things. You'll find a begging bowl at the door. But I hope to see you downstairs in a few minutes. Thank you very much.